I want to introduce Greg Holland from the National Center of Atmospheric Research. Greg is a PhD in atmospherics, or has a PhD in atmospheric sciences from Colorado State University, but he's actually an Aussie, or an Australian. You'll hear his accent shortly. He spent many, many years studying climate change and atmospheric sciences, and is a self-described atmospheric sciences nerd. So I consider that a compliment, by the way. And we will look forward to hearing from him. Joining him on stage will be Jason is back, and then also Julian Stroh, who I'm sure Greg will announce. Are we ready?
We're ready. I
okay.
think. No, we're
Off
not.
we go.
We've got one person coming up yet. Yes, just while Jason is getting his microphone on, let me thank you, Jim, by the way, and let me reintroduce you to Julian and Jason. We're going to have a general fireside armchair conversation about several things in relationship to the topic that we have on our program. And what we're going to do is mostly talk amongst ourselves, but every now and then I'll sort of come back to you with where we're going in the next few minutes, just so you have an idea of exactly what we're doing. So if we look at the topic for this particular session, it's a little bit strange. Science does not care. Do we or don't we? And the answer is partly we do and partly we don't. And when I say that, people look at me aghast. You mean you don't care? We care very much that the information we have is not getting out with the right priority to the people that are making the decisions. We care very much when information that we have gets not so much taken no notice of, that's fine in the context of other priorities. We care very much when that information is attacked senselessly. It's attacked simply because someone wants to kill that information, not because of anything that's actually wrong with it. We also care about society, and I don't know any scientists that will not get and do not get a thrill when their work is actually seen to be doing something in society which is useful. And a lot of us actually deliberately make sure that our work is geared towards that useful activity. But then again, we don't care. And we don't care because science is built on a foundation that you just don't play with. It's a foundation of looking for and increasing understanding and knowledge in an open environment where everything is critical. It's all very pleasant as a general rule, but it's critical. And the only goal is to actually understand exactly what's happening, to have that knowledge, and then to take that knowledge and build the necessary tools so it can go on and benefit society. What we don't care for is when politics and other things come to us and say, well, that's what you found out, but you're wrong. And they don't come to us and say, and here is the evidence that's wrong, like a scientist would say. They come to you and say, but I actually found a little bit of evidence. Or actually worse, they do what we call in Australia playing the man in a game of football. They don't actually attack the message, they actually try and kill the messenger. So all of those things come into the particular title of this session. I'd like to give you a little bit of information on my personal experience, and I'm going to over to my colleagues along the same lines. I've been working with media all my life, and I've had good and bad, and I have to say mostly good. But in 2005, we just happened to publish a paper which said that the proportion of intense hurricanes around the world had gone up by about 40 to 50%. It happened to come out at about the same time as Katrina, so you might imagine that it was an interesting topic for the press and everyone else. And what came out of that was I was doing 5, 10 media interviews a day. One marathon session, I did 15 live radio sessions in just under 4 hours. And I was exhausted, and I eventually, just after a few months of this, I took time off and thought, well, okay, how am I going? And you know, I wasn't doing very well. I really wasn't getting the message out. What had happened was that a number of colleagues, former colleagues, were now actually arguing viciously against me. What I'd done was I'd actually polarized things instead of bringing things together. And what it also was receiving was what can best be described as interesting hate mail, death threats. And it's sort of, you just pass those off. But then on 2 occasions, I received emails which said in some graphic detail what they would do with my mother if they caught her anywhere in the street. And that wasn't very pleasant. It made me more determined, but it also made me determined to move away from that let's fight it out and slug it out in the media to actually interacting directly with individual groups and whole societal groups. And so we set up this thing called the Engineering for Climate Extremes Partnership, being facilitated by NCAR, and also the Rising Voices. Engineering for Climate Extremes Partnership is groups of society, industry, academia, government that get together and decide and priorities for research. Rising Voices is a collaboration with the Native Americans of our great country here, and they also work together with the Engineering for Climate Extremes Partnership. And it's really pleasing to see a meritocracy now appearing, because it actually has, if you look at it in its basis, a very similar goal. I think we can gain a lot from that aspect, and that is where I'm actually devoting my time now. So that's enough from me. I would like to actually start with Jason in this case, because he's already touched on some of this in his previous talk. And is there anything you want to amplify on both what you just said before, but also in this general area?
Well, the media, the public's very interested in climate change, we find, and the ice story kind of sells itself. We find there's very much interest, and so we do really like to connect with journalists so that they can help get our story out to amplify that. But we've also been generating our own media because we think that we can actually tell the story more precisely. And using social media, we've managed to amplify the scientific message and do citizen engagement in science in pretty powerful ways. So I think it's very important that people are very aware of these issues, and it's hard to compete with all kinds of other important issues that are coming out. But because climate change keeps ramping up the reaction of ice, that story has managed to continue to compete in the headlines.
Julian.
Well, Jason, you raised an interesting point in your presentation about education, that we need more science education and science literacy, and that's something that has come up many times in different venues. And it is important, but there's another importance as well. So while science education, I think, is incredibly important, there's a recent poll that came out. I have a colleague, Larry Hamilton, that's been doing these Arctic polls up in New Hampshire for several years now. And in his last paper, he was showing that actually only 38% of the people that were polled actually knew that the North Pole is over sea ice and not on land. And less than 30% of those respondents actually knew that if you melt sea ice, you're not going to raise global sea level. So there's still a far way we have to go, I think, with climate education. But the other problem that we run into, so if you poll people and you ask them sort of basic facts, do you understand what the greenhouse effect is, for example? You know, a lot of respondents will get that question right, and it doesn't really matter your ideology about whether or not you understand that. But when you start asking the question, are greenhouse gases increasing? Is Arctic sea ice melting, for example? Then you see this big polarization, and especially politically, as to how people believe that. And so then we have sort of this biased assimilation that's going on, in that depending on your beliefs, you will maybe ignore facts such as sea ice is melting, which is scientific evidence, but then you'll weakly grab onto these claims that there might be a recovery. And so I think we're very challenged with science communication on how to talk to these different groups of people.
Yeah, it's like when accepting the science, accepting that sea ice is actually retreating and that human activity is behind that. If accepting that means also accepting that your ideology about energy and politics, if it means that that's fundamentally flawed, it makes it very hard for people to accept that. So I sense that's where a lot of reluctance comes. Also the fact that people's kind of worry budget is already filled, and taking on such a grand scale issue as climate change is just way over people's capacity to deal with that.
So let me go a little bit further down this path. Uncertainty. In science, we're very good at handling uncertainty, and we actually have to include the uncertainty because I can guarantee you, as you heard in the previous speech, we don't have any idea what the exact answer is, and we never will. So we have to have an uncertainty component about it. And scientists handle that very well. Unfortunately, when you work with the general public, and indeed when you work with a lot of scientists, that comes across as being weak-kneed and undecided. How do you both handle that question?
That's always a hard one, and you know, because since my research area has really been focused on Arctic sea ice over the past several years, and everybody really has been asking the question, when are we going to see an Arctic Ocean ice-free in summers? Everybody wants that date, but yet, does that date really even matter in the context of climate change? Because there's always going to be a lot of natural climate variability, there's going to be ups and downs on top of that long-term trend, and so even though we're going on this trajectory, the date as to when it happens, I don't think is that important, and yet that's what politicians ask for. When I've talked before with former Vice President Al Gore, he wanted me to give him that exact date. We can't give that. There is a lot of uncertainty, and I think scientists, we tend to be rather cautious because we know that there's a lot of uncertainty. We know that there's a lot of chaotic systems in our climate system that we can't predict, for example. And I think, you know, how to handle that with the general public, that's where it gets more tricky because there's still a lot of confusion, I think, even in the media and how climate's reported or weather's reported that mixes the two together. And so people are very confused as to what the two mean.
It's been called deep uncertainty, how we will always be faced with, especially when looking out 100 years, what that actual number will be, that precise number. With sea level rise, we really won't be able to say it's 3 feet, 6 feet, 9 feet or more until it's basically too late to do something about it. And so there's this paradox with like forging policy that would mitigate this risk. I think and kind of the reality, we just have to think about this as a risk issue, and to minimize that risk, we obviously want to keep on the safe side of that risk because we won't ever know precisely how the precise sea level rise, for example.
Jason makes a very good point there. We've all heard the infamous statement, you know, the known knowns, the unknown knowns, etc. Well, there's uncertainty in the natural system, there's deep uncertainty in the natural system, and there's uncertainty in human beings. And do you want to guess what the biggest uncertainty is? And we have to take that because if you look at the forward projections for greenhouse gases, that far outweighs anything else that's uncertain in the natural climate system. So just remember that as we go ahead as well. I'd like to move on a little bit to a segue into a slightly different area now, very much related, and I'd like to start off with a bit of a fable. We're watching a car drive down a dark country road. They're speeding somewhat. They've been to a party for the evening, and the party was a great one. The wine and the food flowed well, and there was good camaraderie and everything else, and life is good. And further down the road, they see some flashing lights. Now, those lights could be a policeman waiting to book them. It could be a bad accident that's closed the road. It could be just some trivial thing on the side of the road that they don't have to worry about. Prudence would say they'd slow down, but they accelerate forwards. And you have to ask yourself, why on earth would you do that? Well, if I can go to Julienne, we've had nearly 1 degree of global warming. We're seeing the impacts. We're accelerating towards 2 degrees and God knows where. Firstly, why do we care? And what is it from your expertise and background that you can tell us about the consequences? And here I'm talking about both the bad and the good consequences.
Wow, okay. That's a good question. Well, so what's been interesting about studying the polar regions, and especially the Arctic, where we're seeing such profound changes happening at a more rapid pace than we've ever been able to forecast with our climate models. So at the point that Jason raised earlier in his slide, this whole faster than forecast, is that the changes that are happening in the polar regions are a result of our activities here at mid-latitude. So we're driving these changes that are happening. And it was interesting, so when I went into my PhD, I understood that snow and ice are very important in helping regulate the temperature of our planet because they reflect most of the sun's energy back out to space. And so if we start losing the amount of snow and ice on the planet is going to start warming up. We have this positive feedback effect. And so I understood that, and that's part of the reason I went into studying ice and for my career. And when I started doing sea ice work, we started seeing these changes in the Arctic Ocean, but I didn't really think that we were seeing maybe the effects of human activities yet. We had a lot of variability from year to year, and sure, we had a low year in 2002, and then it kind of kept getting lower. And it wasn't until I actually started doing some comparisons with what our climate model forecasts are showing and what the observations were showing, and I realized that, wow, what's happening in our real world today is way worse than what any of these models are forecasting at that time in 2007. And that was a huge concern, and that's when I started really thinking, well, what is going on? Are we really starting to affect our climate system in a bad way, and are we going to start reaching this tipping point? And at least with my work, what I'm understanding now by understanding the processes in the Arctic Ocean and what's happening is that the temperature changes that we're seeing and where we're headed today, we are going to see an Arctic Ocean that's ice-free in summers. And it's a little bit disconnected from the rest of us here at lower latitudes, but obviously by changing the whole Arctic environment, by removing the sea ice, you're not going to necessarily raise global sea levels because it's like an ice cube in a glass of water. But what you are doing is you're warming the Arctic even further, which then starts impacting on places like Greenland, enhancing Greenland melting. But it also impacts on our weather systems, which Jason alluded to a little bit in his talk. And as scientists, we're really trying to better understand how the whole climate system functions all together, because we know that everything is connected. And as we start changing one part of the system, and we're rapidly changing the Arctic, and it's going to affect all the ecosystems up there, all the human activities up there, and the social systems, but it's also going to start affecting us here at lower latitudes. And I think this is the thing that we really need to better communicate, I think, to the general public, that everything is interconnected.
Yeah, about this 2-degree limit, anything above which is considered dangerous interference with climate. It's a dangerous target. We need to aim much lower than that. And we know that because even at today's warming, which is 0.6 or 0.8 Celsius, we're already losing Greenland and Antarctic ice, raising sea level at a rate of about an inch per decade. And if that's doubling at a 10 to 12 year doubling time, that's 3 to 9, 10 feet of sea level rise by the end of this, even this century, and that's very uncertain. So clearly at 400 parts per million CO2 where we already are, and if 2 degrees is the target, that's a target for disaster. We clearly need to bring carbon down out of the atmosphere, not just limit emissions. There's lots of discussion about bringing emissions down, a lot of very exciting technologies coming out of this meeting. But we need to bring carbon out of the atmosphere. And I love this one idea that's got 5 wins, and that's massive planting of trees, which produces sustainable timber, carbon sequestration, I mean, that's the point. Carbon sequestration, sustainable timber, wildlife habitat, humidification, and jobs. That's 5 wins out of a lot of reforestation. So, and that gets us into the carbon sequestration. It won't take us the whole way there, but that'll move back that risk time to hitting those dangerous temperatures. It just pushes it further back and not just limiting emissions.
Yes, and the point that Jason's making there is that I've done this on my farm, and I've been carbon negative for many years. But as those trees are growing, I'm coming out of carbon negative because now the trees are recycling. There's no net carbon going into the system, but it does buy you time, and there's lots of ways we can do that. And I'll just add to both of those, and that is that Forget about global warming. Most of the things we're talking about we should be doing anyhow. The place is really stressed regardless of the global warming. The global warming is what's going to break us. So let's think of those things as well along the way. If I could move on a little bit now, a little bit more to the sort of research that you're doing, and also some of your colleagues are doing, say, that you'd like to tell everyone about. Also, I'd like to start there. Julianne, we were talking yesterday a little bit about Jim Hanson's latest paper. Would you like to start there and then segue into whatever you'd like to say from your own perspective?
Well, and I have to admit I have not read Jim Hanson's latest paper, so I think Jason will be better to talk about the
yes,
paper.
you can pick it up. Would you like to pick that up?
Yeah, I began reading it, and I've read all of Hanson's work. I found it extremely prescient. I've started this new paper, which is very long, and I'm finding it very credible. The line of thought that gets to these scary high sea level rises, Hanson is considering 5, 10, 20, 40-year doubling times for sea level rise. And the evidence is pointing to those shorter doubling times. And so about this 10-year doubling time comes out, and that equates to about 5 meters of sea level rise by the end of the century. It's really hard for even the climate scientists, glaciologists to conceive of that. And an example is in 2007, a paper was published that tried to put an upper limit on how fast land ice could go into the oceans. And they said, okay, you take all Greenland glaciers, you 10x their speeds, starting today to the end of the century. What does that give you? And also with Antarctica. And it didn't get to, it only got like kind of 2-3 meters in a scenario that wasn't very plausible. That was 2007. What that study didn't factor in was that surface melting would then take over in 2007 through 12 due to a persistent atmospheric circulation that just drove heat onto Greenland. That was not in the climate forecasts. It really wasn't, it was without precedent. And so the scientists, they did their best, and their plausible limit was off by more than a factor of 2. And these were smart people. They just hadn't seen what was around the next corner. And so Hanson, he's using past data as kind of an empirical lens into the future, and I find it credible. And it's great that this paper causes a lot of discussion, because conventional scientists, Hanson's always seemed to be ahead of them. And as I read this study, I so far don't find problems with it.
Yes, I also must, before we go to Julian, I don't find any problems with it, and Jim is one of the people that I respect and admire a lot. We talked about uncertainty beforehand, and I have to say that what we're seeing here is an uncertainty this wide, and I do think Jim is tending towards this limit of uncertainty. There's nothing wrong with that. We need to warn people. If that's going to kill you, you should take some notice of it. Forget about the rest of it. But that's the sort of, that's the information you'll be hearing and reading about in the news and everything else. As other climate scientists, climates kick in with perfectly good science that's going with that.
Yeah, he frames it in terms of risk.
That's correct.
He's framing it in risk in his grandchildren. That's the title of his book. And I've got a kid, and we just need to kind of prepare for the worst and hope for the best. But these are some of the worst case scenarios. It's true.
I agree entirely. And the other point before we go to Julianne that I think is really critical, we often think about climate warming as being this sort of gradual climate change, regardless for what reason, this gradual change. And that's not the way that non-linear systems, which is the atmosphere and the ocean and everything associated with it on the land, that's not the way they work. I come from a background of non-linear fluid dynamics, and if you actually start to gradually force a non-linear system, it'll quite often just keep chugging along like it is. And then suddenly it'll get to a critical point, and it doesn't just start going up nicely, it actually jumps from here to here. And that's why we often hear about things like the sea ice. There is this feedback that is occurring in the sea ice, and again, going back to the uncertainty, we get asked, you get asked, I get asked, and I'm not even a sea ice person, when is it going to occur? And all we can say is that jump is going to occur, it's already occurring, we can't give you any more information than that. So this comes back to this whole uncertainty question as well. Julianne.
Well, I do agree. I do think in my lifetime I will see an Arctic Ocean that is ice-free in summers. And it'll probably happen in the next 30 to 40 years, but again, we can't give an exact value on that. There's some climate model simulations that say it should happen in 2020. There's some that say it won't happen until 2080. So there's a huge range of uncertainty in these. The one thing, though, that I find very interesting about, especially with the sea ice system, for example, is that we're not completely doomed necessarily. So if you run climate mitigation scenarios, even if you were to lose all the sea ice in the summertime, you can bring it back. And if we were to commit to a 2-degree global temperature rise by the end of this century, we can keep sea ice right now in the Arctic Ocean at levels that we're seeing today. So we won't lose it all. And that's actually really good news. And I think with our science, like I don't necessarily believe that that's where we're going to end up. I think we're going to end up warmer than that. I think the Arctic Ocean will go ice-free in summers. But I think we also need to really focus on that there is this optimism that we can actually change the system and we can reverse some of these changes that we're seeing. And I think, as Jason raised in his talk, there's a lot of things that we don't yet have in our climate models. And so we need to constantly try to improve our models. They're great tools for understanding how the climate system functions. They're very good tools for helping us understand what are the future projections if we keep increasing greenhouse gases, keep doing business as usual. They give us these scenarios of what's going to happen. There is a large range of uncertainty, but they're very consistent generally with each other on the direction of a change that's going to happen. And I always found that really interesting, especially when you think about Greenland melting or Arctic sea ice, because every climate model can be in their own phase of natural climate variability. They could be showing increases or decreases, but the fact that they all show the Arctic sea ice decreasing really implicates greenhouse gases and human fingerprint as the cause for the changes that we're seeing, so we can change it. And so a lot of times when I give public talks, we show the results, we show, what sea level rise can be and what could happen in terms of maybe impacts on global weather patterns, things like that. But there is also this message of hope that we can actually make things better if we want to commit to reducing greenhouse gases and really changing the way that we're living and using this planet.
Well, I think that we probably will have to forfeit quite a bit of coastline, even if temperatures are, say, if we hit 1 degree. Because today at 0.6, 0.8, Antarctica, Greenland, and mountain glaciers are already on their way out. In today's climate, Greenland is lost. It's more slow, and we're heading to 2-3 times that. And there is an irreversibility for Greenland. Warming beyond a certain threshold sustained for enough time leads to inland thinning, and then you cannot regenerate that ice sheet without another ice age lasting many tens of thousands of years. So what we're risking. So yes, it won't be water world, there's still plenty of land, but the economic disruptions of that forced migration of people will be felt inland and globally. We see that coming. We can slow it down. Could we reverse it? By bringing atmospheric CO2 somehow down to 350. That should be our goal. It shouldn't be 2 degrees, 1 degree. It should be 350 parts per million.
And of course, we're coming towards the end now, so just a brief final comment from both of you, then I'll wrap up.
I like to stay optimistic. I really do, because otherwise, as a climate scientist, you would constantly be depressed. It's an interesting time to be doing climate science. I mean, the pace of climate change is happening so fast, and I think as scientists, we're really trying hard to keep up with our understanding of what's going on. And it's a very exciting time in science, and obviously we always think we need more data, but we also need more ways of processing all of this data and the system level understanding like we heard in the ocean talk before this. So I think there's a lot of, again, I try to stay optimistic because I think that there's still a lot of things in the climate system we don't fully understand, and there's other feedback mechanisms that might help us not be so doomed, hopefully, in the future.
I'm also optimistic when we can get behind a system of education. That's a clear theme that's come out here. It's been great hearing that from everybody. A system that will educate people globally to raise their awareness so that they can make the informed decisions. So society has to elevate that. That's really our challenge, and we need to do that fast. And I think we can do that fast with social media. because it's so pervasive and widespread. That education product just has to compete with the existing kind of junk information that's on there, and I think we know how to do that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take a second to just thank Chip and Sally for all the great work they've done and all the volunteers for making such a great meeting here. Very much thank my colleagues. Thank you for listening through. And there are two things that come out of this I'd like you to go away with in the sense of longer term. There was the meritocracy and the Engineering for Climate Extremes Partnership. Please look them up on Google, find out more about them. They would both love to hear from you. If you want to come and talk to us later, please do. You'll find that we're a bunch of geeks, but we rarely bite, so please come up and have a chat. Thank you.